Yeah.
Okay. Well, you just let me know when it's time to get started.
Yeah, because it's 8 o'clock in China, so it's a little bit earlier. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I found you also give the University of what? Yeah, so sorry. You also do some work in the University of Birmingham in UK.
Yeah, I teach a short course over there each year.
Okay.
The Catchment Science Summer School, and it's mostly European students that join, and we have about 30 or 40 that participate each year. Okay. And it's a 1 week or a 5-day course in early September. And Chinese students are very welcome. We've had a couple from SUSTech and another couple from Tsinghua over the years.
Okay.
So yeah, it includes a number of other colleagues from Europe, Jan Seibert and Ilya van Meerveld, Chris Soulsby, Dorte Tetzlaff, and then colleagues from Birmingham as well, David Hanna and Stefan Krauss.
Okay, maybe this year, maybe you also doing some give the lecture with virtual.
Yeah, that's right. It was, and maybe also this coming year, quite likely could be virtual also. In September 2021.
So yeah. So I think we can also do some summer school.
Yeah.
And yeah. Also, we can also would like to combine do some.
Yeah.
If
that could be very good. Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Good. I'll make a note of that.
Yeah, we can discuss later. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe 5 minutes. Later we can start.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. No problem. All right, what do you think, Professor Penn?
I think we can start, yeah.
Okay, and you will do the recording?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, well, welcome everybody to this class, Hillslope Hydrology. My name is Jeff McDonnell, and I'm a professor at the University of Saskatchewan at the Global Institute for Water Security. And as I was just chatting with Professor Pan, I'm also affiliated with the University of Birmingham in the UK, where we, a group of us, deliver an annual short course on catchment science. This particular course for the BNU students is going to occur over a 4-day period, and this is the outline for the lectures. So today, October 28th, we'll focus on the evolution of thinking on runoff mechanisms from the first work of Robert Horton in the early 30s to the end of the first international hydrological decade, and I'll talk about that. We'll then have a lecture on October 30th, looking at isotope tracing, and then we'll switch to modern concepts of hill-slope runoff generation, and then more recent work focusing on how the hydrology of hill slopes behave between rain events. So thinking about deeper groundwater recharge and also plant water uptake. I'm not sure if there are many students from the Masters of Water Security program, but if there are, there's going to be some overlap between these lectures and what I maybe guest lectured in for 1 or 2 classes with Magali. But anyway, I'm looking forward to it, and I believe the structure is that each lecture will be roughly 1 hour, and then we have about 30 additional minutes for questions. But if anything is unclear, then simply unmute yourself and ask a question as we go along. But I'll engage most of the questions probably at the end. And really, there are 3 things that we are going to focus on through this class. What's the source of runoff? What's the flow path of runoff? And what's the travel time of that runoff? These are the 3 kind of central questions for this whole course that we're going to look at over these 4 different lecture periods. This lecture is on this first topic, the evolution of thinking of runoff mechanisms. And we're going to think about how ideas evolved and introduce you to some of the key literature. I know some of you are doing PhD work or even postdoc work, and always getting a link to some of the key papers I think can be very useful. We'll talk about these key studies and concepts and also the methods that are used. And Professor Pan asked me to pay attention to that. I spent last year in Europe, where I was really amazed by European history, because as a Canadian, I struggle to really put all the pieces together. So this was a book that very much helped me, written by an Australian professor. And the way I'm thinking about this lecture is it's kind of like a shortest history, not of European history of Europe, but of Hillslope hydrology. So that's the way you can maybe think about this lecture. It's a compressed history lesson in a way. Now, what are we trying to do when we think about the flow path, flow source, and travel time of water? We're really trying to do this. This is our big challenge. How can we take the hydrograph that you see here on the bottom of these 2 graphs and understand the time source and geographic source components? Meaning, what is that blend of rainfall or snowmelt water, and how does it come out at different times in the hill slope or catchment hydrograph? And then spatially in the landscape, where does it come from? This is our challenge that we're trying to deal with in this course generally. And our scale is the hill slope. Why the hill slope? That is because it's the fundamental landscape unit. So we're maybe thinking about processes that are happening at a regional scale or a large catchment scale, but really where the water is stored and released and the mechanisms that generate stream flow, it's happening in the headwaters and on hill slopes that make up those headwater basins. So keep this image in the back of your mind as I go through the lecture material. We're focusing on the hill slope scale, the delivery of water as it falls to the Earth's surface and moves to a stream channel. So this is our scale. And again, I think Professor Pan is recording this lecture, and we can send around the URL for this if there's ever material you'd like to look at again or hear more slowly or review. Now, there are many, many papers that have been published on what is the objective in hill slope hydrology. I really like this one by Sivapalin in 2003. And he's talking about the way to deal with the complex processes at the hill slope scale. Because any one of you who have dug a hole in the ground have probably been amazed by the range of pore sizes, preferential flow paths, complexities once you get into the subsurface. Even the surface has a lot of micro topography that makes surface flow even very complex. And this quote is quite good, I think, because what Siva is saying here is that to get at simplicity, we need a mechanism to whittle down the unnecessary process details, reduce them, and transfer those dominant process controls from the hill slope to the watershed scale. And this is really what this course is about, trying to respond to this paper and these ideas. And I'd encourage you to look at this. It's a very short commentary you might find useful. So think of this class then as a short synthesis of hill slope hydrology, of course, but rainfall runoff processes, catchment hydrology, stream flow generation processes, headwater catchment hydrology. These are all similar terms for what we're going to cover over these next 4 class periods. So that's really what the class is all about. So you can still exit Zoom if this is not what you were expecting in this class. Okay, so today we're going to start off with this topic of what is the evolution of thinking? How have ideas evolved from this period of 1933 to 1974? And we're going to talk about a lot of papers and studies today. And what you're going to see is that they are all a certain demographic. Today's process hydrologists are a wonderfully diverse mix of men and women from many countries and many areas around the world. And some of them I'm showing here, just that I picked off the web, who are actively working in hill slope hydrology and these questions of runoff source, flow path, and travel time. And in fact, a lot of important work is going on right here in your groups. Professor Pan runs a very exciting hill slope erosion group. Who is doing some really interesting work in the Tibetan Plateau with hill slope trenching. Professor Qian at Tsinghua University in the middle there is doing some very nice hill slope trenching work just outside of Beijing that I visited last year. And of course, really unique work going on with Professor Waizu Gu's group at the National Hydrology Research Institute in Nanjing. This is the Hydro Hill catchment, and this is a really unique facility. I mention this because today we're going to talk about papers from mostly, I don't know if you've heard this expression before, OWG stands for old white guys, and DWG stands for dead white guys. So this is because these are very older studies in this period, 1933 to 1974, when we weren't so diverse as a community. So I just wanted to acknowledge that as we go here. We'll be talking about some of the folks listed here, many of whom are still alive, but some have passed on. But this is the important work to understand as the kind of benchmark reading for starting off in this field of Hillslope hydrology. Okay, so when we talk about this period and we talk about the evolution of thinking in Hillslope hydrology, it really centers around three periods. The first is Horton's early work, starting in about 1933. Then the first international hydrological decade that began in 1965. And then the beginning use of stable isotopes in Hillslope hydrology. And that commenced, let's say, around 1975, after this first international hydrological decade. So we're going to start off talking about this first period that began with Horton. But before I do, I just want to acknowledge that when we think about rainfall on a hillslope or snowmelt on a hillslope, there had been thinking on this even before Horton, in terms of where does water go when it rains, what flow path it takes to the stream, and how long it gets there. This is a beautiful slide from Scotland, and this is a very typical low intensity, long duration rainfall event that often happens in the UK. Now, in the UK, in Ireland, the first attempt at modeling this, and we're not going to talk about modeling so much in this course, but just to tell you that there were already models by 1851. Look at that date, 1851. This is in Ireland for an area that looks rather similar to the previous photograph. And this is the work of Thomas Mulvaney. And he's come up with an equation, QP, which is peak flow. Q is always flow. P is the peak, is equal to CAP. So C is a coefficient, A is the area of the catchment, and P is the amount of precipitation. And this model, believe it or not, is still used very much in North America in consulting industry today. Basically, the bigger the catchment, the more rainfall, the more runoff you get. So the reason I'm showing this is that if you are doing modeling in your master's or PhD work, it's important to know how long we've been going after predictions in hillslope and catchment hydrology. And this was the first runoff model. The other model I'll mention is this is a kind of a very lumped, almost regression-like model. This is the first distributed runoff model at the catchment scale. This is from 1892. So this is work of Imbo in France, so not far from the UK. This is for the Durance River, and he was developing this to predict flooding on the Durance River. It was the first distributed model. It even allowed for snowmelt runoff generation at different elevations within the watershed. You're seeing the outline of the watershed or the catchment here. And again, this type of modeling continues today. So a lot of work had gone on even before Horton, and I just want to make it clear that many other things had been done. Darcy's law was again in the 1800s, long before Horton's work. But why we're starting with Horton is because he really was the first hydrologist interested in hillslope runoff that really had a deep impact in thinking. So he wasn't the very first scientific hydrologist or even one interested in hillslope hydrology, but his work was certainly the most important of the 1900s or the 20th century. So this is why we're starting with Horton. His ideas really began process interests. So those previous models were really not including any processes. Horton's work began the process understanding. So what we're going to do in reviewing some of Horton's work is kind of look at these pieces of the flow components on a hillslope. So rain entering the soil surface, generating overland flow, continuing to infiltrate through the soil, forming through flow or lateral flow, and then deep percolation even farther down into the soil profile. And I want to just make sure we're all comfortable with the terms I'm going to use. So I will talk about things like subsurface storm flow, through flow, interflow, lateral flow, all interchangeably. So they all effectively mean the same thing. That's lateral flow through the soil, in the soil itself, as opposed to overland flow over the soil surface. So this is the context for today's lecture. And Horton did these field studies in around his home in upstate New York in the Northeast United States. And in papers that followed his early work in 1933, he published important work on infiltration equations and diagrams of rainfall runoff. One of the key initial ideas was this idea of surface detention. That is, those bumps in the soil surface needed to be satisfied before overland flow could occur. And as those bumps were filled, water was infiltrating into the soil, sort of losing along the flow path, as it were. Think of a losing stream. That water is flowing down the stream channel, but it's also infiltrating into the bed. And the stream is not growing and discharge with catchment area like you would normally think of, but it's, we call it a losing channel. This is kind of the same idea as applied to hill slopes. But the thinking is that infiltration is in excess of soil infiltrability, and as a result, overland flow occurs. So this is the rainfall intensity greater than the soil's infiltration capacity. And this is a small cartoon of it here on the right-hand side. So Horton had a very detailed and nuanced understanding of not just runoff generation, but infiltration. This is some of his work from his files that Keith Bevan has identified in a series of boxes that exist at the National Archives in just outside of Washington, D.C., where he has about 90 or 100 boxes of files of unpublished work and hand-drawn diagrams like this. Again, this would be from the 1930s or thereabouts. You see infiltration capacity on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And this is Horton's own writing of what infiltration would be like in response to a square wave input of rainfall that you can see on the right-hand side. That is a square wave input. And what you see is a decrease in infiltrability through that rainfall, going down to a kind of a steady state value and then rising again after the rainfall event. And you can see his writing, if you can read it, the reason for the reduction in infiltration capacity initially is things like colloidal transport, packing of some of the grains, and then reaching that stable value, which is the final infiltration. And this is where his Horton infiltration equation that you can see above was born, this kind of work. So Horton was really doing some of the first important process work that formed the basis for this field of Hillslope hydrology. And over the years, this was turned into operational runoff models, now based on infiltration excess. So here's from an engineering manual in 1942. On the y-axis is the rainfall rate or infiltration, and on the x-axis is time. Again, you see the rainfall. It turns on. It's the same intensity for a period of about 120 minutes or so. And what do you see? You see rainfall on for that whole period, and you see runoff beginning, not immediately, but after a gap. Think about, we can talk about this during the question period, Why is there that gap before runoff starts? Why is there that threshold? And then look at infiltration capacity. It's going down exactly out of phase or with the runoff going up. The runoff then is increasing. It's not going up to the rate of the infiltration or of the, the rainfall intensity. And that's because there is still infiltrability. So look at that amount of infiltration and look at that difference between rainfall and runoff. And that's because water continues to seep into the soil even as you're getting overland flow. But this was the basis, and still is, of much of the operational runoff modeling, now based on processes, not Q equals CAP, as we saw from the early work of Mulvaney, but now based on some mechanism, and that is infiltration and runoff associated with infiltration excess overland flow. And it would look like this. So this is just water running over the surface, and that's because the rain intensity is greater than the soil's infiltration capacity. Now, this idea was quite widespread until about the early 1960s. And this was a paper that tried to reconcile that if you go out to a field, even a disturbed area, where infiltration capacities are reduced and you get overland flow produced in this method, not all of this area is producing overland flow, as you can see in the diagram here. Only what were called partial areas are contributing runoff. And this was an important paper by Roger Betson, published in JGR in 1964. And his idea was this notion of partial area overland flow. So rather than overland flow occurring over the whole system or whole hill slope, Betson's idea was that you had these kind of hot spots, these so-called partial areas, and these were the zones producing the Horton type infiltration excess, but not the whole hill slope, just like you saw in the photograph. So this is the way the thinking evolved from the early work in the 1930s till about 30 years later in 1964 with this work of Betson and this concept of partial area overland flow. So the idea is that overland flow everywhere, the early thinking was replaced by overland flow only on certain areas to generate runoff response. And there's a very nice paper in Hess right now by Keith Bevan called The Era of Infiltration. And he does a very nice historical summary of this period of time. And it's kind of known as this era of infiltration. And this is a quote by a hydrologist from back in the 1940s, Howard Cook. And here is the quote, again, written in 1946. Some future historian of the development of scientific hydrology will probably be tempted to call the present period, that is that period from 1933 to 1964, the era of infiltration. At any rate, the preoccupation of contemporary hydrologists with the infiltration theory of runoff and the vast amount of energy that they expended in an effort to turn this concept to practical account will certainly be put down as a distinctive feature of our times. So this really is the thinking in Hillslope hydrology in those early decades. It's all about infiltration and infiltration excess and overland flow as a result. Now, that quote and that last paper by Betson on the partial area concept was just 1 year before the beginning of the first international hydrological decade. And this is a very important time in hydrology. This is when we gauged about 9,000 catchments worldwide and developed observations of rainfall runoff in ways that had never happened before. And that's what we're going to talk about now. So this second key period that started in 1965 and went till 1974. And in Canada and around the world, this was a big enough deal that it even made its way onto stamps. So here's a stamp with the IHD on it, the International Hydrological Decade. Many students here might not know what a stamp is, or a letter. This is before email, when we used to write letters. And so this was a big deal all around the world. In China, in North America, in Europe, a lot of work began during this first International Hydrological Decade. One of the key areas early on in this decade was this site in the United States, in North Carolina, called the Coweta Hydrologic Lab. And what you're seeing is that part of the hill slopes that were studied at Coweta. And also you can see, of course, that these are forested hill slopes. And just think about the infiltration capacity and infiltration behavior of forested hill slopes versus other types of hill slopes. The infiltration capacity is very high as a result of the forest rooting activity and so on. So what this means is that overland flow in this kind of environment is rarely observed, even though the streams respond quickly to runoff, or to rainfall, I should say. And this caught the imagination of really a key pioneer of hill slope forest hydrology, John Hewlett. He was a professor at the University of Georgia in the United States, and also had worked with the US Forest Service. And this is a very important paper in 1967 that he published, Factors Affecting the Response of Small Watersheds to Precipitation in Humid Areas. And he did many studies on hill slopes, both artificial and natural. So this is a artificial slope where he'd done some work in previous years. But it's really moving beyond this era of infiltration to an era of subsurface storm flow, subsurface flow. He was very much influenced by earlier work that had been published around this time. This is some work by Horton and Hawkins. This is a different Horton, so not Robert Horton. This is a different Horton. But this is work that had used tracers to look at the flow path of rainfall from the soil surface down to the groundwater, or to the water table. And this had shown, using tritium in this case, which was very prevalent then with thermonuclear bomb testing that was peaking around this time in the mid-1960s, they were able to determine this kind of movement of water in a piston flow-like way vertically into the soil profile. And this is a quote from this paper. Our studies show that the percolation of rainwater through the soil to the water table is accomplished throughout most of the flow path by downward displacement of previously retained water by the soil at field capacity. So the idea is that you've got this piston-like flow downward. And this is what Hewlett built upon to develop what he called the variable source area concept. And this is still a concept in hill slope hydrology that dominates today. And here's a diagram of it. First you see the hill slope in cross section, and you see an expanded soil profile. And those arrows are showing the movement of water in the soil profile and the displacement of water now laterally down the slope. And this is happening when the channel on the left is kind of expanding and contracting, depending on how much water is moving in that lateral flow direction. So we'll have a small quote from the paper here. And he's talking about, this is Hewlett now in this really important hill slope paper. He's talking about variable source area hydrology. The subsurface flow of water from upslope exceeds the capacity of the soil profile to transmit it. The water will come to the surface and the channel length will grow. This is in essence the variable source area concept. So this was really a change in thinking fundamentally. Here we're going from this infiltration-based view, this idea of surface partitioning of Horton, and now really focusing on what gets into the soil and moves laterally through the soil profile. And the idea that what comes in, a fraction will be some of the actual raindrops that fell, and then the other will be produced by a process of displacement. So he really imagined in these diagrams that the water upslope would push out the water downslope, and you see at the bottom of the hill slope the water table coming to the surface. And really the number one important factor was the soil mantle depth. So how deep was the soil in terms of filling that storage and producing lateral flow? So this is really an important paper, and if you're doing any work in Hillslope hydrology, this is very much worth reading. And in terms of summarizing this international hydrological decade, this paper noted at the bottom here by Fries, which was a review paper of the first international hydrological decade, he talked about how the development of this variable source area really occurred through many papers that had occurred previous to the original Hewlett work. Just, I think, showing how any concept is really an iteration of ideas from different people. And this is true then, and it's still true now, I would say, in our field of Hillslope hydrology. Now, the other thing I just mentioned briefly that Hewlett initiated or developed was this idea of a quick flow separation line. So here you're seeing a hydrograph discharge on the y-axis versus time, and he came up with a unified way to compare hydrographs from different places. And he used this separation line to separate so-called quick flow from delayed flow. And the slope of that line is one that you would use in your catchments in China, my catchments in Canada, other people's catchments in the UK. And we would separate the hydrograph with this 0.55 liters per second per hectare per hour. And that would enable us to compare quick flow volumes across our different basins once we had normalized the discharge by catchment area. We'll talk more about that a little later in the lecture. Okay, so where are we? We've got the variable source area concept. We're in the first international hydrological decade. We've talked about the partial area concept, but there are two pieces to this variable source area concept: saturation overland flow and subsurface storm flow. Let's start with saturation overland flow. This is that part of the base of the hill slope next to the stream channel. And these are some of the key papers that had looked at this in this early period, mostly during the first international hydrological decade. And I would say again that this variable source area concept is still probably the longest standing kind of theory in hill slope hydrology, our most durable theory for different conditions. So this paper in 1970 by Dunn and Black was really one to help us understand how saturation excess overland flow worked in the context of the variable source area framework. This was published in Water Resources Research as part of Tom Dunn's PhD work. And really what it enabled the field to understand through this trenching that was done along a stream channel. You're seeing here, you see the distance meter down in the bottom left, so that's 50 feet. So this is quite a long trench of about 300 feet or so at the base of a hill slope. And this work helped us understand saturation excess overland flow, where not only is water coming laterally down slope and kind of piling up, as it were, at the base of the slope, water tables locally were rising to intersect the soil surface, and as a result, any water falling onto that saturated area near the channel ran off as overland flow. But overland flow due to a rising water table, rather than overland flow due to rain intensities greater than the soil's infiltration capacity. And Dunn and Black had some very nice work where they instrumented the base of hill slopes and showed these mechanisms of how water tables would rise, and you would get this so-called return flow along with the subsurface storm flow through the soil layers on the hill slope. Now, if we look at this not in cross-section like you see here, but in a plan view on a map, this is what they found. These were watersheds in the northeast United States in Vermont called the Sleepers River watershed. And what you're seeing are two time periods. In the black, this is before the, say, rainfall in this case, and then the stippled area, the slightly darker area, is during an event where that saturated area expands and contracts. Again, what's part of this variable source area idea, but really focused on the saturation excess part of it down at the base of the slope. These saturated areas, you can see, they're visible. Here I'm working many years ago at this same catchment. This is a photograph I took just showing during snowmelt then that saturated area. And this is really water table exfiltrating in the valley bottom. And you can see in this cartoon on the left how that would affect the storm hydrograph, where once you get to quite extensive surface saturated areas, then the hydrograph is responding quite rapidly because you're getting a lot of overland flow produced by rainfall or snowmelt onto these saturated zones. This will operate in China, Canada, all around the world under certain conditions. And those conditions usually are gently undulating topography, a water table near the stream that's rather close to the surface, and usually in more humid environments. And the beauty of it is that you can see these saturated areas. You can use this very sophisticated measuring device called the squishy boot technique, where you walk around this wet area that encloses the stream channel, and you can define then the expansion and contraction of that saturated zone. You can map it, you can see it. Here's a photo from Switzerland, and you can make it out based on different vegetation assembly. So enclosed by this red line then would be this kind of soggy ground. And if you have a soils background, these would be glade soils, G-L-E-Y, mottled, waterlogged, and often you get a different vegetation assemblage, vegetation that's able to withstand anoxic conditions, meaning low oxygen because it's always wet. So subsurface or saturation overland flow is a vital piece of this variable source area concept, and is a piece that's understandable because we can see it, we can map it. The other piece is subsurface storm flow. And here are some of the key papers through that first international hydrological decade. And this is tougher to understand and measure and map. And that's because the boundary conditions are largely unobservable. So here's a site where much work has gone on in Hillslope Hydrology in this area, in Oregon in the northwest United States. And you're seeing an area with high precipitation, steep slopes, but really little, if any, saturation overland flow. It's all driven by subsurface storm flow from up on the hill slope through the soil itself, and with these largely unknown boundary conditions. Now, Professor Pan asked me to comment on methods and studying this particular, or these processes, and I would say that maybe you've seen this famous painting before, if you've ever toured art museums in Europe, but this is what it's like to study subsurface storm flow. And that's partly because it's so difficult because you can't see it. And often we're resorting to approaches like trenching that Hu is using in the Tibetan Plateau, for instance, and we'll maybe talk about his work later on. Now, some of the first work to get at the subsurface storm flow had to devise a technique to make quantitative measurements. And these are troughs. Sometimes they're actually called the Whipkey Troughs, and that's because of this author, Ronald Whipkey, who published this paper in 1965. And here you can see these troughs or gutters that are established at different positions down through the soil profile. And this is capturing lateral flow that's occurring at these different layers. And here you see another picture of it in the bottom right. But if we look at the data from this very important paper in 1965, and just keep these troughs in the back of your mind in terms of where they're located, just look first at the left-hand plot. So the left-hand plot is showing subsurface storm flow on the y-axis versus time after the beginning of rainfall. And now you can begin to get an idea of how complex subsurface storm flow is, because each of these numbers are these different troughs that I showed you in the previous diagram. So the first one is near the soil surface, the second one is deeper, and then with each number it goes deeper still. So what you see is that there's very little overland flow from that trough number 1. Trough number 2 is dominating flow, but it shuts off pretty quickly once the rainfall ends, and it is then supplying water to trough 3, which is down at 90 centimeters, that continues to form the majority of the falling limb of the Hillslope hydrograph. And what's difficult is that even at the same site, under different rain intensity and antecedent wetness conditions, you can have very different behavior of the Hillslope subsurface storm flow process. So the diagram on the right are those same troughs, but for a different kind of event, a lower intensity event, but on wetter conditions. This is why we largely ignore this in our Hillslope models. But as process hydrologists, this is something we need to lean into, because this is reality. This is how these systems work. Despite the complexity, we need this process, as I talked about earlier with the Sivapalin quote, a way to whittle down those process details, those unnecessary details, to deliver something simple and clean at the Hillslope scale. The work by Whipkey was followed by this work in the UK, and this is by Daryl Wayman at East Twin Brook in the southeast United Kingdom, or southwest United Kingdom, sorry, I should say, just south of Bristol. And this is a wet place, and this is a Hillslope populated with tensiometers. So these are devices that record pore pressure or matrix potential. And what you see on the right then, as a result of these matrix potential measurements, is a view of how water table is building, not only down at the soil subsoil interface, but you see through the rain event to the peak of the rain event in the lowest Hillslope there. The water table is built, but is growing upslope as a saturated wedge. And this was really quite informative to build on the earlier work by Whipkey, to begin to understand how the whole Hillslope became engaged by growing really a subsurface saturated area upslope, but all below the soil profile. And this was this idea of saturated wedge development and the sequences that Wayman looked at with his work. Again, using these tensiometers, these pore pressure measuring devices, as the key tool, in addition to the kind of trenching that we talked about. These are measuring the internal characteristics that give you insight into the building of these pore pressures and flow paths. The last one I want to make reference to in terms of really the key process advancements was this work by Tim Burt as part of his PhD. He studied with Malcolm Anderson. He also worked in the southwest United Kingdom, and this was at McDonnell, a Hillslope site that you can see in the background. And this was a photograph with Tim not long before COVID started, where we were visiting his catchment. This is a very important paper because for the first time, it took the hill slope work that had been in two-dimensional cross sections and now looked at it in 3 dimensions. And what you're seeing here are maps of topography and maps of matrix potential using tensiometers that we saw in the previous example to look at where on the hill slope water was being pooled or developing in the subsurface and then delivering water to the stream channel that you can see along the bottom of these plots. So each of these 4 diagrams is showing you different times through the hydrograph. So upper left is prior to rainfall, bottom left is at peak rainfall, and then bottom right is 2 days after the storm. The reason why this is important is it's showing that topographic convergence and accumulation of area is very important for the behavior of the hill slope. And if you know anything about topographically based rainfall runoff models, top model for instance, or the topographic index where you look at the upslope area and divide it by the local slope angle, this is really where these ideas were born. And if we look in this study of contributions from hill slopes to the stream channel, so on the y-axis is the discharge from the slope, and then the x-axis is distance downstream. What you see is a very uneven delivery of water from hill slopes to streams. And this was another really important contribution of this paper in 1978. And it's showing that these hollows, the accumulation zones, were the key delivery points for water, and the nose slopes or spurs, or not the hollows, there's not much water coming out. And this is a theme we'll get into in the next lecture as well, even when we drill down to the hill slope, individual hill slope pieces, this differentiation between hot spots and cold spots for runoff delivery. And this just shows you again that how the hollows are dominating the delivery of water to the stream. And this all came from this very important work in the late 1970s. Now, even at the end of the first international hydrological decade, there was still skepticism about the importance of this piece of the variable source area, subsurface storm flow. And this is a quote from this important review paper where he's saying what is in doubt, reading in blue here, is whether subsurface storm flow can deliver sufficient water to provide significant contributions to storm runoff. The quantities measured by Hewlett and Whipkey were small, and the authors did not relate the outflows to the channel hydrographs. So here he's saying, well, I'm not so sure if this is an important process or not. But following the first international hydrological decade, work started coming out in places like this. This is Oregon again. This is the H.J. Andrews experimental forest. These are steep volcanic soils. They look a lot like sites you might see in Japan. It's part of the Pacific Rim. This is, again, Oregon is just north of California on the west coast of the United States. Annual precipitation here is about 2,000 millimeters, and slopes are steep. So here's a small 10-hectare catchment. Here's a hill slope that was studied. And the study was by a hydrologist named Dennis Haar in this paper in Journal of Hydrology in 1977. And the thing I want to draw your attention to here is that he calculated this quick flow. Remember the thing that Hewlett and Hibbert had introduced to the field 10 years earlier? And what he's showing here in the last column is that subsurface storm flow as a percent of quick flow is almost 100%. So what that means is really the only mechanism delivering the storm runoff to the stream channel is the subsurface storm flow. So this really is kind of putting to bed any question of whether or not subsurface storm flow can generate storm hydrographs. And then for those that attended my lecture a couple of weeks ago about MyMy, this work, if you recall, followed on the Haar work only a couple of years later. This is the the paper published by Mosley in 1979 in Water Resources Research. Again, a very small catchment. The Har work was in a 10-hectare catchment. This one is even less than that, almost less than half of that. Again, high rainfall, steep slopes, and as you'll recall, and hill slopes that were monitored. And as you recall, again, subsurface storm flow was able to generate these very rapid hydrographs that you see here on the left from these hill slope positions that we talked about in that lecture. So again, very high runoff response, very high quick flows, and all attributable to this part of the variable source area concept, subsurface storm flow. The thing at this site, though, and as we talked about, and I'll end with this last diagram, is that this was largely from soil pipes at the soil bedrock interface. My slides have a mind of their own. Here we are. This at the soil bedrock interface. These soil pipes, as you recall, were the mechanism that were allowing subsurface water to be released very quickly from these hill slopes during events and to create those rapid storm hydrographs. All right, so what does it all mean? Well, at the end of the first international hydrological decade, by the mid-1970s or so, this was really the way in which subsurface storm flow was imagined. Either with these saturated wedges that you can see, like Wayman had identified, topographic convergence based on the kind of findings of Burt, 1978, Anderson and Burt, and then these lateral flow characteristics at different interfaces, like Whipkey's work, and then like Mosley's work, preferential flow could be very important as well. This was a textbook, an edited textbook by Mike Kirkby that came out in 1978 called Hillslope Hydrology. And if you want one reference to bring it all together, at least at that stage of the field's development, this would be the book to get. And this is still available in used bookstores around the world. It's really an exceptional book, probably the best that's ever been written in Hillslope Hydrology. Now it's quite old, of course, 1978, but very much worth looking at if you're able. Okay, let me try to wrap up here and have some time for questions. What have I said? I've tried to identify that this period, these different time periods, and today we've talked about Horton 1933 up until the end of the first international hydrological decade, was so important because this is when our first concepts were given to us by our hydrological forefathers, as it were, and these were periods of intense paradigm shifts in our thinking. So remember, from the mid-1930s to the mid-1960s, it was really the era of infiltration. Overland flow dominated, even if it was overland flow only on these so-called partial areas. But with the first international hydrological decade and the gauging of thousands of headwater catchments, we began to realize that during rainfall and snowmelt events, infiltration excess overland flow was perhaps not so common, and that these other types of behaviors under the umbrella of the variable source area concept were important to understand and define. And really, this whole idea shifted us from a kind of an overland flow partial area concept to a concept really that was based on and centered on variable source area idea, where you have expansion and contraction of these saturated zones. But the thing I want to leave you with, and my last slide for today, is this. Even though these different runoff processes, as you see here in the legend in the left-hand side, Horton overland flow, which is the infiltration excess overland flow, saturation excess overland flow, subsurface storm flow in green, or channel flow, if you like, they can all occur simultaneously in the same watershed. And indeed, if you go to Professor Qian's headwater catchment just outside of Beijing, and you were there during some heavy summer rain events, you could probably see all of these mechanisms occurring at the same time in different watershed positions. This is a lovely diagram from some modeling work, Marcus Weiler's group from a few years ago for a catchment in British Columbia in Canada. And it's just showing on the landscape where you see these different types of runoff mechanisms, what percentage that might represent of these different parts of the Hillslope system, and how this generates a combined hydrograph that we see at the integrated headwater catchment scale. And these are largely forested watersheds, but looking at how land cover as well can affect these kinds of processes. So even though there are these different runoff mechanisms, they can all be occurring even in the same watershed, just in different ways and different places. So that's something to keep in mind as we go on next week to look in more detail at other processes. And maybe as we transition to the next lecture, just keep in mind that as we go from the late 1970s into the 1980s, really hydrology as a field, Hillslope hydrology, really went in two directions. Some continued field work and then started bringing in stable isotopes as a tool, and that's what we're going to talk about. But many more turned to catchment modeling because by the mid-1970s or so, there were mainframe computers that enabled more modeling approaches to Hillslope hydrology, and many more went in that direction. And we'll talk about that again as we go through the course over these next several lectures. So I'm going to stop there and then look to the group for questions. You can ask them by unmuting yourself, or use the chat if you like, and we can do it that way as well. And maybe I will also stop sharing my screen and we can perhaps see each other a bit as well. Okay, so yeah, questions. Or comments.
Okay. Maybe I have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just Jeff, thank you for the presentation. And you mentioned the variable source area from the just in terms of the runoff generation.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering what's the breakthrough in the recent years on just in the this research area, just a variable source in the runoff generation in the different catchments. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question, and the lecture 3 is going to talk about that. So that'll be the focus of lecture 3.
Okay.
But I would say that the breakthrough in thinking between the introduction of variable source area in the mid-1960s and our thinking now in 2020 is that hill slopes are very threshold-like. So rather than that gradual wetting up, things are very non-linear in the sense that you have rainfall, you have antecedent wetness conditions, you have the characteristics of your given site wherever it is, but it's very likely that the hill slope is not going to kind of turn on or activate until some threshold is exceeded. And I think that is a very different mindset or viewpoint to the early kind of framers of the variable source area concept. And once it is activated, it's delivering large amounts of old water that was stored in the hill slope prior to the event. And this is different to papers like Mosley and others who saw the hill slope runoff as largely rainwater. And I guess maybe the last thing on that question is the reason for the threshold behavior is that we now know that our hill slope surface, both at the soil surface and below, is very bumpy, very irregular. So we're getting this kind of filling and spilling occurring that creates the so-called emergent behavior at the hill slope scale. And this view is quite different to the way people thought of that in the mid-60s, I would say.
Yeah. So it's very complicated. So yeah.
It's complicated, but then it's simple as well, in the sense that if you can figure out what that threshold is, then now you've got an understanding of the behavior of a unit of landscape that could be very helpful to you. So with Hu's work and his major professor Lee, in Tibet, it'd be it's exciting to think about what the thresholds are for activation of those hill slopes, and to compare that with the thresholds for some of the slopes I referred to tonight. And it's a kind of a framework to think about maybe classifying hill slopes in different places, all in the context of this kind of nonlinear behavior, these thresholds that are really controlled by filling and spilling. That'd be my thinking on that.
Yeah. So do you think the variable source area, the concept, is very important for the prediction the runoff for in the catchment in the following years maybe?
Yeah, well, it's still the basis of most runoff models today. The model structure is really formed on variable source area. The problem is, and the thing maybe that we've learned as well, is that the runoff processes are so highly scale dependent.
Yeah.
So if you look at a small plot or a hill slope or a catchment or a large watershed, the processes that are dominating will be very different, even if it's the same place, but just because of the different scale. So variable source area it's difficult to cover all these different scales, and it's difficult also to cover non-humid areas. So more arid or semi-arid areas, variable source area doesn't really apply as well. So I think there's, again, thinking that's going on with the idea that runoff is scale dependent, that it's very threshold-like at all scales. I think the current thinking is, and I have a paper in review on this, we first need to define our scale, and then once you define your scale, you're looking for what's kind of filling and spilling and activating in a non-linear way, rather than thinking of aggregation of small scales to create the large scale.
Yeah.
That's a different way of thinking as well.
Yeah, thank you. I also am interested in the surface flow, because the surface flow is very related to with soil erosion, and how to separate the surface flow, the subsurface flow, and it's very important to predict the soil erosion in the also.
I mean, I'd look to you for advice there. I agree. They're very much related, and probably we could learn more about runoff from the erosion part, because of the concentration of flow and the fact that even small depressions in the surface can concentrate channels. We see that in the subsurface as well. Again, on lecture number 3, I'll show some photographs of what seems like surface erosion, but in the subsurface down at the soil bedrock interface. And it'd be great if you're there for that one to get your thinking on that kind of subsurface erosion as well, through soil pipes, through eluviation, through other soil forming processes. I think that's, interesting area of research.
Yeah. Because as the rainfall, the Hillslope occur, the rainfall occurs in the Hillslope. Maybe the rills will occurs in the Hillslope, and the flow velocity will accelerate. And then changes the hypergraphs.
Yeah. Well, I think you're getting at, I guess, the network-like behavior of hillslope runoff, and rather than a continuous sheet across the slope, it's happening through little rills and small, tiny channels. And I think that's another thing we recognize on the hydrology side, is that there's a lot of concentration of flow that occurs in these micro topographic channels. And that's what's concentrating flow, but also, I guess in your case, concentrating the erosive aspects of the water flow.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any comments or questions from the students in the class? You can type something into chat. Questions?
Hi, teacher. I have a question.
Yeah.
I wonder how the soil thickness affects the Hillslope hydrology process, or how the soil thickness affects the separation of subflow and subsurface surface flow and subsurface flow.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, in that 1967 paper by Hewlett and Hibbard, they noted that soil thickness was really the most important factor. And I think that what we've learned since then is that that is true, but when you think about maps of soil thickness over a hill slope, it's really quite variable. And the soil thickness is quite heterogeneous. And what that means is that you have, again, concentrated flow of flow paths in the subsurface. I'll show these again in lecture number 3, where the soil thickness distribution is really controlling the flow path distribution on the hill slope. So it's not only the upslope area and the local slope angle, it's also the thickness distribution across that domain, because that's what's really controlling how things are filling and draining, or storing and releasing water. So that's a key piece. The problem is that even now in 2020, soil thickness is very difficult to map. And of course, there's geophysics like radar, ground penetrating radar, or ERT, you might have heard of, electrical resistive tomography. But still, it's a very difficult to derive a high resolution soil depth map. But that's what's critically needed, I think, for the next generation of hill slope models.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions or comments?
Hi, Jeff.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also maybe just the request, and you mentioned the Hillslope hydrology book, maybe the small book.
Yeah.
That's you mentioned that the book was published in 1978.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, edited by the Collectivity. Yeah. So
yeah.
maybe I cannot find the English version in China. So can you give the means we can buy it? Yeah.
Yeah. Let me see what I can do. There might even be an online version I can find.
Yeah.
But I'll see what I can do and get you a copy. Okay.
Yeah. Also in China we have the Chinese version, but sometimes we can maybe we can not understand the real meaning. So maybe yeah.
I will see what I can do in terms of getting a copy to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
I'd be very happy to try and do that.
Yeah.
Hi, Jeff.
Hi.
Question.
Yes.
So, what is the key point of the Hillslope hydrology in the next stage, and how to understand the hydrology collectivity?
Yeah. In terms of future research.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, right. It's a lot. Again, that'll be in lecture 3. I'll talk about that. But it's really about connectivity. When does it connect? How does it connect? Why does it connect? Some of it relates to these questions of soil depth, but also it relates to the kind of the flow path architecture at a hill slope or at a site. What we find is that the flow path of water can sometimes be quite different to what the surface topography would suggest. So for instance, on your hill slopes, you might imagine that water is flowing at right angles down the hill slope. But what you find if you put a tracer on is that the water could kind of meander and follow some funny flow paths down slope because it's making its way down to an impeding horizon, backing up, and then following that subsurface topography. Let me try to show you one slide. This will kind of be, oops, I need to share my screen here. Share screen. And then here. Okay, can you see my slides?
Oh, no.
Let's see here. Can you see, oops, you see the slides now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I don't know how to do this other than this way. Don't look, because this is next lecture. Close your eyes. No, I'm kidding. Okay, almost there. So here's a hill slope. So the upper surface is the surface topography, and the lower surface is the subsurface topography, meaning the impeding layer or the soil bedrock interface defined by both ground penetrating radar and pounding metal rods into the ground until refusal. So this really forms two alternative hypotheses of flow downslope. You could base your model or your perception of downslope flow based on the surface topography, or you could do it based on the subsurface topography. And in fact, if we go to, let me go back, let's create, with those same data, sorry, let's create a topographic index, right? This is, for each pixel we compute, this is the same hill slope now. For the surface topography, we create the topographic index distribution. So that's area of each pixel divided by its upslope area. So the more blue the color on the left-hand plot, the blue is the flow path defined by surface topography, right? Water flows downhill and water accumulates as you go to larger and larger pieces of the hill slope. So if you believed that water flows, or you could predict the water flow down slope by the surface topography, then I don't know if you can see my cursor, but most of the water would come out here. Can you see my cursor?
Yes.
There? Yeah. But if you then base this on the subsurface topography that I showed you in the previous slide, this is now the topographic index distribution based on the other topographic surface. And now here, wherever my cursor went, here it is. Now the water is going to come out over here on the left-hand side. And in fact, when we did experiments at this hill slope, this is where most of the water came out. Why? Because it went down through the soil that is variable in thickness, but it exploited that subsurface topography to move down slope. And I think this is common in many places that I've looked anyway. It may not be a soil bedrock interface, it might be the soil saprolite interface, it might be the interface between the saprolite and the weathered rock or not weathered rock, or it might be the soil till interface, like a glacial till. But in situations where water is able to infiltrate, this subsurface topography can often drive the spatial patterns of flow. So I think, you know, to the future then is somehow relating these internal hill slope processes to the emergent behavior at the base of the slope. And with your work, you know, that's looking at hill slope hydrology due to thaw, I think it'd be very interesting to think about how do you, how do you understand, how do you illuminate the black box of the hill slope to understand the key processes that are turning on your hill slope? How can you whittle down those complexities to deliver the dominant process controls that activate the whole hill slope? Now, just imagine, this is something I wanted to show you anyway. Imagine a very narrow swath down this hill slope, and do that in your mind's eye on the right-hand one, the one with the subsurface topography. If you only chose a very narrow slice, you're not going to get the full picture, because it's really, it's almost like a dendritic network of channels, isn't it? And here it's about 20 meters wide. 20 meters wide, we need to see that full range of flow paths at this scale. So it'll be interesting to kind of think of your really impressive trench work, but you're also restricting a very narrow layer down a long slope. Yes. And probably under natural conditions, water will want to move outside of the boundaries of your hill slope. And how to think about that in the context of the slope generation. And then I guess too, how much of your hill slope is activated. Remember, we looked at, oh, I don't know if I can, sorry. Let me just show you one more quick slide. Back a little bit. Almost there. So for instance here, on your slopes that are very long, these slopes here that I was walking on last year in England, where Wayman did his work, they're quite short, aren't they? This is, if I had to guess from memory, this is maybe, I don't know, 20 meters. Yes. You know, 25 meters. Your slopes are quite long, aren't they?
Yeah.
They're, I don't know, 100 meters or something like that. I don't know. How long are your hill slopes?
17 meters.
70?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if they're 70, the question is then, does your, do the processes that you measure at your trench, are
Yes.
they representative of the whole slope or the lower half of the slope? Or maybe it's only the lower quarter of the slope. What are those processes at the trench representative of your 70-meter slope? I think that's another interesting question. Yeah.
The whole slope.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, if this was your hill slope, would you imagine the subsurface contributing area reaching all the way up your 70 meters of hill slope? Or would you imagine maybe it's only going up a few meters or 10 meters? So that while you're trenching the full 70-meter slope section, maybe it's only the lower portion of the slope that's important for generating the signal at the base of the slope.
Yes.
That's my question to think about. Yeah.
Yes, I understand.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really good questions. My runoff flow is too narrow, so it cannot clearly to show the subsurface flow passes.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is a very good question.
Yeah. Yeah. So I look forward to a chance where you and I can have a Zoom meeting and we can look at your data, and I'd love to ask you more questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jeff.
Sure. Here's a question from YU. Can I read it? In the slides you just showed from next lecture, is the coincidence of flow path observed in the subsurface topography mapping as an indicator of displacement effective storage? And if so, with higher or lower, like the field in Georgia, rainfall, how will that flow path change? Yeah, that's a good question. So it's kind of like the flow paths are now permanently set almost in the hill slope. And it's determined by these kinds of almost like channel-like properties based on the soil depth distribution in that subsurface topography. So now depending on how big the event is, it's kind of like a mini hill slope scale variable source area, because the contributing area will be larger or smaller depending on how big the storm is, if that makes sense. So the flow paths stay the same, but how much of them are activated, that can change depending on the size of the event, if I understand your question correctly. Good. Well, these are good questions. I see we're just about out of time. I think Professor Pan, the next class is I have it here. October 30th.
Yeah, October.
Right?
October 20th, 30.
Yeah. So that'll be when we'll meet again, and the lecture then will be on. I can show my screen if that would be helpful, just to remind everyone of the topic of next class.
Yeah.
It's going to be difficult to move when I'm sharing screen here. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, the next class will be on isotope tracing, and we'll talk about how that really changed the thinking on our understanding of Hillslope hydrology. And then, as I made reference to a couple of times today, November 4th, we'll talk about the current concepts of runoff generation, and then the week later we'll talk about aspects of Hillslope hydrology outside of precipitation events.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff.
Good.
Yeah, see you next time.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye
Jeff.
now. Okay.
Bye.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.